राम कृष्ण प्रणाम लह श्री चरणे। हे राम कृष्ण प्रणाम लह श्री चरणे। तुम्ही कमार्प करे गदाधर नाम नियेचिले जन्म ग्रहणे। प्रणाम लह श्री चरणे। हे राम कृष्ण प्रणाम लह श्री चरणे।
Swamiji first came to America by the Pacific route in the summer of 1893. It was not until 2 years and 1 month later that he decided to visit Europe for the first time with his friend in New York, Mr. Francis Leggett, the millionaire grocer, on a deluxe ship. Mr. Leggett was to wed his fiancée, Mrs. Betty Sturgis, a beautiful widow, by now an ardent follower of Swamiji. In Paris, Mrs. Sturgis and her younger sister, Miss Josephine MacLeod, had gone ahead of them and met them at the Saint Lazare station. While in America, Swamiji had received an invitation from Mr. Edward, an erstwhile follower of the Theosophy movement. On September 10, 1895, Swamiji left Paris for London and was received at the London station by Mr. Sturdy, and then proceeded to the latter's home at some 40 miles southwest of London, crossing the from Reading by horse carriage, and spent a few quiet weeks there by the Thames River. Sometime in September, Mr. Sturdy took him to visit Mr. Muller, who lived at Maidenhead, some 15 miles northeast of Caversham, towards London. Miss Muller spent most of her life on women's issues and was, like Mr. Sturdy, an ex-member of the Society, and had even read a paper in the Parliament of Religions at Chicago 2 years ago. At the first meeting, Swamiji disappointed Miss Muller by not subscribing to the cause of her anti-liquor organization. But she soon forgave him and organized a lecture for him at the Maidenhead Town Hall. His first talk in England was delivered on the Eastern Doctrine of Love at the Maidenhead Town Hall on October 17 to a small gathering. A local weekly, Maidenhead Advertiser, reported the half-hour talk. Swamiji said in his lecture, love might be divided threefold. 1. That love which is for one's own pleasure, irrespective of pleasure or pain of others, the purely selfish, the lowest. Second category is that love which exchanges, I will love you if you will love me. We will make each other mutually happy. The partially selfish, the middle path trodden by the great majority of mankind. And third is that love which gives all and asks for nothing without premeditation, and which never regrets, unconquerable by any evil thing done to him from which it emanates. It is the highest, the divine. 5 days later, on October 22, 1895, Swamiji first spoke in London. This time in Princess Hall, a public lecture hall in the Royal Institute of Painters, in watercolors on self-knowledge. The hall was on the south side of Piccadilly, a block away from the circus. The first London lecture was reported by 4 London newspapers. The hall was not full, but the lecture was a success. Part of the long report in the Standard read, "Since the days of Ram Mohan Rai, with the single exception of Keshav Chandra Sen, there has not appeared on an English platform a more interesting figure than the Brahman Sikh who lectured in the Princess Hall last night, clothed in the long orange-colored robe of the Buddhist priest. He spoke for an hour and a quarter in the most faultless English. And near the end, the paper said, he worked out this pantheistic conception of the personal identity of man and God with great comprehensiveness and an ample wealth of illustration, and in passage after passage of beauty, solemnity, and earnestness. The lecture was evidently quite extemporaneous and was delivered in a pleasing voice, free from any kind of hesitation. In London, Swamiji paid for his own expenses, while Mr. Sturdy paid for the lecture expenses. Swamiji moved into a house at 80 Oakley Street, Southwest. It was one of a block of identical 4-story houses sharing walls with neighbors tall and narrow. Here, Swamiji held about 25 classes, about 8 per week, but very little is known about them because no one bothered to take them down, and reporters were also absent. He gave 3 more public lectures in London, at the Balloon Society on November 5, at the South Place Chapel on November 10, and at Reverend H.R. Hewis's residence in Chain Walk, just 2 blocks from Swamiji's temporary lodging at Oakley Street. Through Miss MacLeod, Swamiji came to know Stanton Coet, who was at that time a young minister of 38 of Columbus, Ohio, a disciple of Felix Adler. He was working in London to raise the ethical and moral standards of the poor when Swamiji met him for lunch at a hotel near Piccadilly. Moncure Conway was another American who was minister of the South Place Chapel, the largest congregation of London. He was a rationalistic and deeply loved minister, and he invited Swamiji to deliver the lecture on the basis of Vedanta morality at the South Place Chapel on November 10. At the house of Reverend Hewis, 150 guests assembled In their large drawing room with 7 windows facing the Thames on November 16 to listen to Swamiji's speech. This house was built in 1717 at the time of Henry VIII. Reverend Havis and Canon Basil Wilberforce made speeches in reply to Swamiji's speech. Swamiji became a good friend of Wilberforce, who was part of the Church of England and an earnest student of Vedanta. Swamiji, who pronounced a lot of rhetoric against the British in 1893 when he stayed with Professor Wright of Harvard, came to like the British as the time went on. In letters to Mary Hale and Alberta Sturgis, he wrote with satisfaction that Englishmen received him with open arms. Not all English clergy were sympathetic, but they did not wage a campaign against him as was done previously in America. Swamiji attended a private gathering at Mr. Mortimer Reginald Murgison's house on November 10 at the invitation of Lady Isabel Murgison, who had attended Swamiji's talk at Prince's Hall. It was at this house that Miss Margaret Noble, who would become Sister Nivedita later, first saw and heard Swamiji as one of the guests. She, however, did not accept Swamiji as her master until the following year, 1896, when he visited England on the way to India. England at the time was a melting pot of new ideas. She had witnessed the scientific discoveries that shook the foundations of Christianity. There was a need to re-establish religion according to science and reason, and Swamiji felt that various aspects of Vedanta philosophy might fulfill this need. He, however, did not want to start a society in England immediately, but wanted to wait until one of his brother disciples arrived from India to take charge. Accordingly, Swami Sharadananda came a few months later, but by then Swamiji had gone back to New York, sailing from Liverpool on November 27, 1895. In his second visit to Europe, Swamiji left New York on April 15, 1896, reaching London a few days later around April 20. He came to stay with Mr. Sturdy, and Swami Sharadananda was already there. Mr. Sturdy had rented the Murgison house at 63 St. George's Road, where Swamiji had spoken to a gathering on his first visit to England. Swamiji, Swami Sharadananda, and Swamiji's younger brother Mahendranath Datta spent a few days together at Miss Henrietta Muller's new home at Wimbledon before moving into the Murgison house. Mr. J. Goodwin, who had joined Swamiji in New York in December 1895, also came to live there, along with Miss Muller and Mr. Sturdy. Mr. Mahendranath Datta was a minute observer and has left some detailed descriptions in his 3-volume Bengali book Londone Swami Vivekananda, about the life at this house. 28, 1896, Swamiji and Mr. Sturdy went to nearby Oxford to meet Professor Friedrich Max Müller. Though Müller was a German by birth, he spent most of his life in England. He knew Sanskrit well and delighted in spending his time with the Indian lore. He translated the Rig Veda in 6 volumes and later edited the 50-volume Sacred Books of the East. Professor Max Müller entertained his 2 visitors and showed them around Oxford University. Swamiji was delighted to meet Professor Max Müller and his wife and said that Müller belonged to Vedic India in a former birth. In his second letter to Swamiji in late April, Max Müller wrote, "As for your beloved master of blessed memory, Bhagwan Ram Krishan, how can I ever tell you what he is to me? I love him and worship him with my whole heart. To think of him makes my eyes fill with tears of gladness that I was permitted to hear of him. If I might only have known him while he was yet with us. My greatest desire is one day visit the spot which was sanctified by his presence while he lived, and I may be so fortunate as to fulfill the wish." However, Max Müller, punned into Moksha Müller by Indian Pandits, did not fulfill this wish. He never set foot on India during his lifetime. He wrote an article in the August 1896 issue of the magazine 19th Century. After meeting Swamiji, Max Müller was eager to procure more raw data on Sri Ramakrishna from him and his brother disciples in India. Müller did write it as a book, The Life and Sayings of Ramakrishna. Between May 7 and July 17, 1896, Swamiji gave 45 classes at his house and also 6 Sunday lectures. Most of Mr. Goodwin's transcripts of the classes were unfortunately lost, saving 1 or 2 which have been included in the complete works. His Sunday afternoon lectures were between June 12 and July 12. The first one on June 7 and the third one on June 21 were transcribed by Mr. Goodwin and appear in the second volume of the complete works. In the third lecture, titled The Real and the Apparent Man, Swamiji said in part, "Man, therefore, according to the Vedanta philosophy, is the greatest being that is in the universe, and this world of work the best place in it, because only herein is the greatest and the best chance for him to become perfect. Angels or gods, whatever you call them, have all to become man if they want to be perfect. This is the great center, the wonderful poise, the wonderful opportunity, this human life. In July, Swamiji chaired a session of the London Hindu Association. Mr. T. J. Desai, secretary of the association, recorded that Swamiji struck the table so hard that Mr. Desai's watch fell off the table. He earnestly appealed to the London Hindus to give up European dress and airs on returning home and mingle with the Indian people and try to help them. Advertisement of his talks in London. The attendance at his July talks at the Royal Institute of Painters fell off as people left London to escape the heat. On July 16, Swamiji held his last class of the season. Swami Saradananda and Mr. Goodwin had already left for New York in mid-June, and now Swamiji decided to tour Europe with Miss Henrietta Muller and the Xavier couple. July 19, they crossed the English Channel and went to Paris, where they stayed at a hotel for the night. The following day, the party started for Geneva by train. Here is Geneva. In Geneva, they stayed at a hotel overlooking Lake Leman, and they went to see an exhibition and also enjoyed a balloon ride high above the city. They also visited the castle of Shillong, which in ancient days was meant for prisoners. And Swamiji was known to have remarked that the dungeons in this castle of Shillong, meant for prisoners, torture chambers in the past, is a very nice place for meditation. Around July 24, they went from Geneva to the French village of Chamonix, partly by train. Swamiji was enjoying the beauty and quiet of these places. Wrote to Mrs. Bull, "The mountains and snow have a beautifully quieting influence on me, and I am getting better sleep here than for a long time." One morning they set out to cross the Muddy Glacier. Led by Miss Muller, who was experienced in alpine climbing. After about 2 hours of negotiating the glaciers, they returned to Chamonix by muleback. They trekked to Little St. Bernard in an arduous 2-day trek, with much of the trip on muleback or horseback aside mountain torrents. From Little St. Bernard, they returned to Chamonix along the same route and then went to Zermatt in the Valais Alps in Switzerland, having a view of the great Matterhorn near Zermatt. This is Zermatt. Zermatt, one could take trips up nearby mountains for spectacular views on the way. This is the Matterhorn as seen from the village of Zermatt in Switzerland. From Zermatt, one could take trips up the nearby mountains for spectacular views on the way. Swamiji went to Mount Rosa, to the glacier on Mount Rosa in early August, and the party returned to Stalden by train and then went to see Saas Fee on muleback from Zermatt. Here are some spectacular views afforded by some nearby mountain tops from Zermatt. Saas-Fee is about 6,000 feet above sea level and is one of the most beautiful valleys in Switzerland. Swamiji was enjoying rest in this miniature Himalayas. He wrote letters to Mr. Sturdy and Sister Christine in this period, and these indicate a peaceful meditative state of existence. Enjoyed strolls through the nearby woods. Nearby woods and mountains in Switzerland. After a fortnight, they left around August 20 for Lucerne in central Switzerland. They went sightseeing in Lucerne and made an excursion by a mountain railway up the Rigi. This is a landmark of Lucerne. Lake Lucerne, Switzerland. Swamiji went for a ride on a day-long steamer ride in Lake Lucerne and also went up a famous mountain railway up the Rigi, the most famous viewpoint in the country. This is such a train, a small train, which takes you up the mountains. It is operated by steam. And along the route you see many beautiful sceneries of Switzerland. The train going up the mountain and scenery from the train windows. In Switzerland. The next went by train to Schaffhausen, which is at the bend of the Rhine River, before crossing into Germany. This is Schaffhausen in northern Switzerland. From Schaffhausen, Swamiji went to see the famous falls of the Rhine River, and this is the most famous falls in Europe, all of Europe, at Schaffhausen. To the walled city of Koblenz on the Rhine and Cologne, they journeyed east to the city of Berlin. He was very impressed by the wide streets, fine monuments, and beautiful parks of Berlin. On September 8, they departed northwest for Kiel, a German town on the Baltic Sea, to meet Professor Paul Deussen, who was 51 years at the time. In 1887, Deussen had already published the German translation of the Vedanta Sutras with Sankara's commentary. This was a great pioneering work of Sanskrit scholarship. He was at the time preparing his monumental translation of the 60 Upanishads to appear in 1897. This particular book, a local magazine, comes from Professor Deusen's personal collection. Professor Deusen and his wife, who had been to India, invited the Saviors and Swamiji to their house several times. Swamiji and Deusen would engage in long conversations, sometimes in Sanskrit and sometimes in English. They also went sightseeing around Kiel on September 9 and 10. Deusen liked Swamiji's company so much that he did not want him to leave. Swamiji wanted to return to London for his lectures. Hence, it was decided that Deusen would also go to England in a few days to be with Swamiji. He spent a night with Swamiji in the same hotel room at Amsterdam. Deusen later recollected, "No sooner than I had gone into the room with the holy man to go to sleep than the first thing he did was to light a short English pipe. I could see no solution other than to open the door and window and give him a little lecture on how bad it is for the health to sleep in a room full of smoke." He spoke Sanskrit very well and English equally well, was lively and clever by nature, was somewhat impetuous in character, a young man abounding with health, full red cheeks, very different from our conception of a saint. But to be sure, these Indian saints are above all restrictions of caste. They eat meat, drink wine. The next day, when we went into a restaurant and we, on account of the exorbitant prices, contented ourselves with a single serving, he helped himself to 2 portions, and since as a saint he was not allowed to have any money, all that was paid for by the English couple. Deusen spent many days in England with Swamiji. In October, Swamiji was getting friendly with Professor Max Muller too, and expected the latter would arrange for his lecture at Oxford, but the invitation never came. Muller explained that the head of each college had to send this invitation and he was not the proper authority. It was around this time that a second brother disciple of Swamiji, Abhedananda, arrived in London from India. Mr. Sturdy procured a new flat for the 2 Swamis at 14 Greycoat Gardens, and Swamiji was to hold his classes at 3 rooms at 39 Victoria Street, close to the Westminster Abbey and within walking distance from the Victoria Station. The 2 sites were within 2 or 3 blocks of each other. Mr. J. J. Goodwin came to London on October 20 just in time to record the last part of Swamiji's classes in London. Transcripts of 15 of a total of 27 classes have come down to us, and perhaps the best ever Swamiji delivered anywhere in the West. Mr. Goodwin has done a remarkable job in noting down this series of London lectures. One of these, based on the Isha Upanishad, said in part, "We are dying of thirst, sitting on the banks of the mightiest river. We are dying of hunger, sitting near heaps of food. Here is the blissful universe, yet we do not find it. We are in it all the same, all the time, and we are always mistaking it. Religions propose to find this for us. The longing for this blissful universe is in all hearts. Though Swamiji was probably at the peak of his performance in London this season, there were very few newspaper reports. Burke had found only two. He had hundreds of admirers that season, and they were all very sorry to hear that Swamiji had decided around November 11 to return to India. He gave a series of lectures at West Croydon, a southern suburb of London, and he gave 5 Sunday lectures here, but not even the titles are known. He gave a lecture on privilege at the Sesame Club on December 6, now in volume 1 of the complete works. Swamiji was delighted to gather from England 3 jewels, Miss Margaret Noble and Captain and Mrs. Xavier, to help in his Indian work. He was given a farewell reception on December 13, held at the Institute of Painters in Watercolors, and his students were sad at his departure. 3 days later, on December 16, Swamiji left England with the Xavier couple for France, thence to Florence, thence to Naples, from which port he sailed for Ceylon on December 20, 1896. Mr. Goodwin joined the 3 at Naples and went on the same ship. Swamiji's third brief visit to Europe was in 1899 to England on the way to America from India. He sailed from India with Sister Nivedita, Swami Turiyananda, his brother disciple, and Satish Chandra Chakrabarti, Swami Saradananda's brother, reaching London on July 31, 1899. Mr. Sturdy went on vacation and nobody welcomed him at the port. For about 2 weeks, the 2 Swamis put up in Wimbledon near Miss Noble's parental home. Miss Noble's relatives came to like him. With Swami Turiyananda, he sailed for New York on August 16, 1899. The fourth and last time Swamiji came to Europe was in the summer of 1900. He reached the port of Le Havre on August 3, 1900, and reached the Saint Lazare station in Paris later in the evening. He put up for a night with Mr. Gerald Noble, who made arrangements for Swamiji to speak at the forthcoming Congress of the History of Religions in Paris, held as part of the Paris Exposition. He then went to stay with the Legate family, who had their four-story summer home at 6 Place des Etats Unis. Swamiji met some of the world's leading personages at this house at parties organized by Mr. Legate, poets, philosophers, scientists, moralists, politicians, singers, professors, painters, artists, and sculptors. Swamiji met many of his American friends and admirers in Paris, as they too had come to witness the exposition. Among people he met at length in Paris for the first time were Sir Hiram Maxim, who was his admirer, and Charles Loyson, a famous ex-Carmelite monk now married to an American woman. The exposition occupied 275 acres near the then 11-year-old Eiffel Tower. There were displays about electricity in the exhibition. Dynamos were displayed inside the palace, and multicolored lights decorated fountains and cascading waters. Every morning Swamiji went to visit the exposition, accompanied by Alberta, Mr. Legate, and Professor Patrick Geddes. The legates went off to a vacation to Germany afterwards, and in their absence there was a Congress of Cranks in the Legate home, composed of Sister Nivedita, Dr. Lewis Janes, and Mrs. Bull, who had come from America, the Geddes couple, Miss MacLeod, and Swamiji himself. Swamiji then lived with a young French poet, Jules Boyce, for some weeks. Swamiji spoke twice at the Congress on September 7 in Paris, and thereafter went to spend time in a villa in Brittany rented by Mrs. Bull, taking Jules Boyce with him. It was a little fishing village of Perros-Guirec near Lannion. Swamiji and Jules Boyce probably reached there on September 17, and Miss MacLeod and Sister Nivedita were already there before him. Swamiji and Jules Boyce left for Paris at the end of September, visiting Mont Saint-Michel on St. Michel's Day, September 29, 1900. This is an abbey on a tiny island off Normandy. He observed Roman Catholic rituals there and commented on the similarity between Hindu ritual and Catholic. Swamiji returned to Brittany for 4 or 5 days with Miss MacLeod and came back to Paris again around October 20. By October 14, Swamiji had decided to return to India. Swamiji took a grand tour by the Orient Express, a famous train that ran between Paris and Istanbul. the Istanbul station. With him journeyed Madame Emma Calvé, famous singer from Chicago, shown here, known to him for many years from his years in America, Miss Josephine MacLeod and Mr. Jules Boyce. Orient Express ran every day between Paris to Vienna, but between Vienna and Istanbul it ran 2 days every week.